Welcome to A Conversation with History. I'm Harry Kreisler of the Institute of International Studies. Our guest today is Roger Daniels, who is the Charles Phelps Taft Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Cincinnati. A renowned historian of U.S. immigration, he is the 2010 Jefferson Lecturer at Berkeley. Professor Daniels, welcome to Berkeley.
Thank you.
Where were you born and raised?
I was born in New York City, but was raised in several parts of the country.
And looking back, how do you think your parents shaped your thinking about the world?
Oof. My father died when I was very young. My mother insisted that one must keep in touch with the world, and was very concerned with the use of language. She'd been an editor. She constantly made me read aloud to her, corrected my grammar when I wrote letters, taught me that accuracy and precision were very important, and that's been very important in my life.
Were your parents immigrants or?
Technically, my parents were immigrants, but my mother came as a babe in arms. My father's family had been in America, went broke in Minnesota after having 2 children, went back to Great Britain. He was born. Then things got better and they came back and settled in Sault Ste. Marie. And so he was born in England. My mother was born in Hungary. But neither of them had any memory of any other place but the United States. So that technically I'm a second-generation American, but really culturally I'm third.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned that you moved around as a young person. Did you begin to develop a sense of America and what it was about? Because in your works there is a real sense of what our values are and what we stand for, and how in immigration we often work against what we are.
I think that's part of it, although I had no notion of this at the time, and my education was interrupted. I didn't go back to school until several years after normal. Was an itinerant for a while. I've made at least $50 in every state of the union.
This was during what years? When you were a young man? Or?
This was when I was a young man before I went to college.
And this would have been what years?
The years really during and after the Second World War. And then I went to college in 1950. Wouldn't apply for a student deferment, so I went to Korea. Came back, finished up my college, started my graduate work at UCLA the year I turned 30. Mm-hmm. So I was a little bit behind the curve.
But let's talk about this itinerant self. So what did you get out of that education on the road?
I got what you said, I think. I think I got a real sense of what the country was like, of how many different kinds of people there were, about the enormous inequities in American life and the enormous opportunities. So I'm great fan of America, but much of what I have written has touched on some of the worst things that have gone on.
What about your schooling before you went to college? Did you have any teachers that influenced you before you made it to UCLA?
I think I had several. I had a 4th grade teacher who was very, very good, and who pushed me always, not just to pass, even and get an A, which wasn't a problem, but to really push the envelope. And there have been one or two or three others at various levels before that who encouraged me. So that was important. But I learned as much out of the classroom as I learned in it.
Mm-hmm. It sounds Woody Guthrie-like. Am I hearing that correctly?
Oh, I don't have that. I don't have that kind of talent, and I.
But powers of observation, if not.
I hope so.
Yeah.
I hope so.
Yeah. And so, where did you do your undergraduate work?
I did my undergraduate work at the University of Houston.
I see.
Which was not, which wasn't what I planned to do. But I got hurt in an industrial accident. Came out with an operation after an operation, and without any money, just before the outbreak of the Korean War, and things were very bad everywhere. And I got a copy of the Wall Street Journal in the library. I couldn't afford to buy one. And found that there were two job markets in the United States in which there was a sign of life. One was in Dallas and the other was Houston. I'd been through Texas. Wasn't the place I wanted to go, but I flipped a coin and it came up Houston. I went there and I started at the University of Houston, which was then not the big state university it is now, but a private institution. And had no intention of staying on there. I knew I wanted to be a historian. I hadn't always known that. I'd worked on newspapers. I thought I wanted to be a journalist. And after I was a journalist for a while, I found out what I wanted to do was own a newspaper and control its policies. And if not, I was working for William Randolph Hearst at the time on the New York Journal American. I decided I wanted to be a historian. And it turned out that they were building a good young history department. Many of the members in it weren't much older than I was, and this was particularly true after I came back from Korea. And I realized that I was getting a great deal of attention. There were very few serious students of history.
This is still at Houston.
This is still at Houston. So because I had no intention of staying there. I wanted to go on to get on my feet economically again and go to a better institution. But I was getting a great deal of education there that I couldn't get anywhere else because of the amount of attention I got from some very dedicated and knowledgeable professors. And so I stayed there, and from there was able to go into a first-class university graduate program.
Mm-hmm. And that was UCLA?
That was at UCLA, where I got a master's degree and a doctoral degree very quickly.
And what years were you there?
I began my graduate work in the fall of 1957, picked up a master's degree in 58, passed my comprehensive exams in 59, and completed my dissertation in the summer of 60.
And what was the focus of your dissertation?
It was called The Politics of Prejudice. The subtitle explains it. The anti-Japanese movement in California and a struggle for exclusion, Japanese exclusion. I had wanted to work on the Second World War incarceration of Japanese Americans, which I'd gotten very interested in. But it wasn't possible to do that work yet because we didn't have a Freedom of Information Act, and most things were on a 25-year rule. So that the last documents I'd want to see wouldn't be available until 1970, and here it was 1960. I wasn't going to wait 10 years, so I needed a topic, and my mentor told me I wanted to do something else, and my mentor said, no, you have to do something. It was back in 57 when I first came there. A fine historian named Theodore Salutis told me, you're going to be 30 this year. Your contemporaries are about to get tenure. You need a topic that you can research do research on, well, you're right here. And I could read all the secondary works and do some research. And then when I passed my comprehensives, I got a university fellowship and spent most of 1959-60 here in Berkeley, working in the Bancroft Library, which has the greatest collection of materials for the early 19th century history of California, and a lot of other things, but that's what I was interested in. And the papers of most of the politicians, including particularly Hiram Johnson and a number of others, so that was where I learned to do historical research, and the people there were a second set of teachers. The librarians there were a second set of teachers for me.
What do you, before we talk about your work on the Japanese and on immigration, let's talk about your vocation as a historian. What do you see as the skills that are really paramount for doing the work of history, and specifically on immigration?
Well, I think there are two kinds of skills that you need. You need, first of all, the skill and essentially the determination, what the Germans call Sitzfleisch, sitting flesh, the ability to sit down in a chair and go over incredibly boring materials, not exciting. You're not reading dramas. You're reading
memos
and
files.
Statistics and files, etc. And then to be able to shape them into a coherent story. And then you need the third ability, and that is to put that story into terms that not just other scholars could understand, but that people without specialized training but interest can understand. Write in plain English. One of the things that pleases me about my own work is that it has been successful. My doctoral dissertation is still in print. Mm-hmm. It's still used in classes. So that I have been able, I know, to communicate to large numbers of, relatively large numbers of people. We're not talking about Stephen King numbers of people, this sort of thing, but that's very important, because if you can't explain it to large numbers of people, you can't get your message across. If your message is one, as I think the message of the story of immigration, the message of the story of the Japanese Americans, the history of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. I'm trying to finish a big biography of Roosevelt right now. These are things that people need to be able to understand. And so that it's that. In addition, I'm probably going on too long here, I've been very fortunate because I've been able to function in part as a public historian, and have participated in several public projects that have, I think, real meaning. I'd first say that I was on a history committee that planned, I'm still on it, and continues to plan, the Museum of Immigration on Ellis Island. And then I was able, as a consultant to a presidential commission, to help shape the report that Congress later used to bring about redress, some, not reparation because that couldn't be done, but some redress for the surviving Japanese Americans that was voted finally in Congress in 1988, more than 40 years after Japanese Americans had been put into American concentration camps.
I want to ask you about one other thing in your work of history, because in your in your works, there is a set of American values that are behind the scenes. It would seem guiding your efforts to not only find the facts but tell us what they mean. What is the, if I am correct in that assumption, what is the source of that? You mentioned your mother, you mentioned your travels as a young person, because as a result of this combination, you have a real sense of the importance of diversity to America, and when that is denied, then the promise of America is denied.
Well, I think I came to respect the Constitution, the ideas of the Founding Fathers, but at the same time always remembering what Thurgood Marshall liked to say, that the original Constitution was a slaveholder's document and had all sorts of things to protect slavery in it. So the Constitution was not a perfect document. It had to be improved. Could probably still be improved, but I think the two scariest words that you can say is constitutional convention if you're talking about a contemporary event. I shudder to think of what a contemporary constitutional convention would produce in the United States. And I think we have to remember that democracy has a dark side. And I've tried to look at the dark side, but never forgetting that that's just a side, and that there are other aspects of American democracy, and that some people, if they become aware of the dark side, can see only that. And that produces an unbalanced view.
In looking at some of your works, I was left with a strong sense that in American history, there's a real ambivalence about immigration, for the good and on the negative, and that in some way you're helping us navigate this tension, and we're seeing ourselves in the mirror, and when we are on the dark side, we over time move away from that because of our institutions and our values. Is that a fair summary? Because we can't cover everything you've written in this hour.
Well, let me say something. Almost every American is in favor of immigration, as long as it happened far enough back in the past. Because very few Americans, except for native peoples, aren't aware that they didn't come from here, that this is not the place where their ancestors lived, and most Americans know where their non-American ancestors lived. But at different times, different groups have been pariahs. And one would think that when the pariah groups got up to the middle level or above, that they would have sympathy for the people who were still down there, but it doesn't work like that. And then there's always fear that the immigrants, and from whenever we're talking about, whether we're talking about the 16th century or the 21st, immigrants have mostly come to America to work. Politicians making speeches like to talk about America came here seeking freedom, seeking religious freedom. That's certainly true. Some refugees have always come here because somebody was chasing them and wanted to take all sorts of things away from them. But year in and year out, what people came here for was to work. Immigrants understand that and generally work very, very hard, quite often harder than most of the folks around them who've been here for a longer time. And that makes for tough competition, and immigrants undercut wages. There are all kinds of problems here. But in addition, immigrants are what has kept and what is keeping the United States from some of the worst problems that are now facing most of the other industrial giants of the world. Japan, Germany, etc., have terrible population problems. Not too many people.
Too many old people.
Too many old people. Not enough children. Germans don't reproduce themselves. And don't like the people who are coming in and doing the work. The United States has a different kind of problem, but it's been refreshed so constantly by immigrants that it can avoid some of that.
You point out that there was always, and of course we are a nation that had slavery, so you know that speaks for itself. But you point out that even some of our founding fathers, when it came to the people near us who had just come, they weren't us. You talk about Benjamin Franklin and a quote from him about the Germans.
Yeah, that's very early on.
Yeah.
Franklin, by the time Franklin's a founding father, he understands, as all the founding fathers understood, that they needed immigrants. They had a big, largely empty country. And if they didn't fill it up, somebody was going to fill it up and take it away from them. So from the time, from the earliest days of the Republic into the 1840s, American immigration policy was simply let them come. And there was no such thing as a quota or a visa or anything else. If you could get here, you were in.
And a real turning point then comes with the Chinese Exclusion Act. You see that as a pivot in our history with regard to immigration.
Yeah, it's not the first. It's not the first.
Yeah.
The first comes in the pre-Civil War decades, when immigration, much of it of Roman Catholics, was a great bugaboo and a great issue. Then the Civil War came, and they realized that these people could fill up the Union Army very, very nicely. There were regiments of Irish, regiments of Germans. The Germans took orders in German because that was clearer. Most of them would have not done the right thing if they had complicated orders in English. And that the real enemies of the Republic were not foreign immigrants, but their fellow Americans of the South. So that changed that attitude. The Chinese Exclusion Act begins the legal restriction of immigration. It's really it's in that sense, it is a turning point, a pivot. I've called it the hinge on which American immigration policy changed. This was in 1882. And like everything else in immigration, before or since, and we're talking about regulations, it wasn't quite honest, because the Chinese Exclusion Act wasn't a Chinese Exclusion Act. That was what a lot of people wanted it to be, but it was really an act to keep out Chinese laborers. And even today, for instance, this is just a classroom joke, but it's interesting. Green cards are pink. Nothing in immigration is exactly as it seems. There was a time when
literally they're pink.
They're not green. Green cards aren't green.
See. So it's a place for the politicians. Nothing.
Well, it's more than that, but it's a very complex issue, and very few of the people who talk about it speak about it accurately.
Now, talk briefly about the background of the Chinese Exclusion Act. It was intimately related to California politics. It was related to the fact that initially the Chinese laborers were some percentage of them were used to build the Transcontinental Railroad. When that was finished, there was mild hysteria in California among the politicians, maybe not mild, that these people would take jobs away from native Californians.
Well, that's certainly true. But in fact, Chinese helped build California. Chinese agriculture, California agriculture would not be nearly what it very quickly became without the labor of not only Chinese, but of other peoples, Mexicans, native people. But by 1882, there'd been for a long time pushing about this. And in the 1880s, we had a very evenly balanced national politics between Republicans and Democrats. The Democrats had been out since before the Civil War and wouldn't get in until Grover Cleveland. But in 1882, the Republicans passed the first of the Chinese Exclusion Acts. There were 15 acts. They were on the books until 1943, when, as a tip of the hat to a wartime ally, Congress repealed the Chinese Exclusion Act, but kept a lot of other anti-Asian acts on the books.
And it is really the case of the Japanese internment where you really this is an important change in how far we're willing to go when an immigrant group is perceived as threatening. And but I think in your book, and let me show that book, Prisoners Without Child, Japanese Americans in World War II. And I recommend it to the audience because it has all of the virtues that you describe of a clear, very clear narrative, which really gives us an account. So let's talk a little about the Japanese presence and how the various factors that came to play in the history of their presence here, that just sort of everything led to their being the first group and only group to be interred for no reason during wartime.
Well, it's very complicated. First of all, of course, one cannot ignore Pearl Harbor. There had been a long anti-Japanese movement in California. California politicians had wanted to do what some politicians want to do now, and that is to make the children of aliens, not all aliens, but certain aliens, who are born in this country and who are therefore birthright citizens. They wanted to change that as far as aliens ineligible to citizenship, because just to summarize the statutes very, very quickly, the Constitution says very little about immigration, but it commanded Congress in Article 1 to create a uniform system of naturalization. So Congress, the next year in 1790, passed the first Immigration Act, first Naturalization Act, which limited naturalization to white persons to free white persons. That kept out not only black people and slaves, but also white indentured servants, who were people who were semi-free on a limited contract. And in those days, voting was public, and just for men, of course, but you had to walk in and say publicly who you voted for. So clearly, if an indentured servant was a man who owned his indenture, having an interest in an election, was not really a free person to elect. That stayed the law till 1870, when the 14th Amendment the 15th Amendment had changed and the 13th Amendment, all these had changed the status of slaves. They included white persons and persons of African descent. Free went out of the law because there was no longer an illegal slavery. And African Americans who were born here were clearly citizens, but African Americans who had been born in Africa, or as many of them had been born in the West Indies, had to be made citizens. So only Asians, and Asians as eventually defined by Congress, which meant that what Congress did was include working westward from Japan, everybody as far as the border between today's Iran and Afghanistan were Asians. And the people of the Middle East, who were clearly Asians, were all eligible for naturalization. So only Asians were ineligible for naturalization. And that affected primarily Chinese and Japanese, because they were the people most here. Japanese took a terrible beating in World War II. By that time, most of the Japanese who lived here, 2/3 of them, were native-born American citizens. So what we were putting in these camps were not Japanese, but were Americans. The phrase Japanese American wasn't much used, but they were United States citizens, and they were put into concentration camps. Men, women, children, and babies. In wartime, you can intern people of an enemy country legally. And in World War II, Japanese national citizens were interned, German citizens were interned, Italian citizens were interned, and by the way, only 14 and up. But the edict that Roosevelt signed is
14 and up, meaning the age?
Yes.
Yeah.
But the edict Roosevelt signed was used to put all Japanese Americans on the West Coast. It meant all of California, but in Washington and Oregon, only about half the state. A Japanese who lived in Seattle had to go. A Japanese who lived in Spokane could stay where he was if there were no specific charges against him, Japanese American.
And so in the end, about 125,000 people were essentially put in these camps.
Just over 120,000 was the total population count.
Now the irony here, as you point out, is that in places like Hawaii, where 1/3, I guess, of the people
that was the only place.
Yeah, were Japanese. They were not interned because they were too important for the economy there.
That's right, and Hawaii was the seat of the war, and until the Battle of Midway, which happened in 6 months after Pearl Harbor, which destroyed enough of the Japanese Naval Air Force that it didn't have the power to mount an attack on Hawaii, although people even the generals and admirals didn't realize fully that was the case for a while. But the crisis was really over by then. But in Hawaii, Japanese Americans and Japanese aliens were largely free. Now the whole place was put under martial law, so that people in Hawaii were not free as other people, other Americans were free. And of course, Hawaii was not yet a state and didn't get statehood, although it had all the characteristics of statehood, until 1959.
Now, we don't have a lot of time, but just in summary, what you're suggesting in your work on the commission that analyzed this and in your books, the volatile mix here was a history of discrimination against the Japanese, the war hysteria, and the failure of political leaders like Roosevelt to manage that hysteria. But then also I get the sense that you're saying that the bureaucracy, especially the military, were ready to act, and then in essence were ready to push the process along and not just implement it. And that all of these things came together to do this horrible deed.
Well, I think we need to stress more, as the commission did, that the general racism of American society against all non-whites and discriminatory treatment against all kinds of people who were white, the terrible inequity, ethnic inequity in American society was part of that. It was just the natural sort of thing to believe. And also they believed that these people were inferior. They couldn't do anything. Some of the leading admirals immediately after Pearl Harbor said, well, they must have had German pilots because they couldn't have done this. The Japanese couldn't have done this accurate bombing. Well, of course, that wasn't true.
And there was a sense that I think I got from your book that the Navy in Pearl Harbor had been caught with its pants down, and that basically by finding an internal enemy, a traitor group within the society, which is what had happened in some of the European countries, whether that was true here or not, it didn't matter. It was a useful part of the dialogue about why we had failed to anticipate the attack at Pearl Harbor.
Actually, the fifth column is largely a myth, even in Europe. And in the United States, it just was not a factor. And in Hawaii, it was not a factor. But in all the materials, and even in the war movies, I'm right now, good old Netflix, I am, for scholarly purposes, watching most of the major World War II movies made in Hollywood during and just after the war. And you take a movie like Air Force, on 3 different occasions, that movie, which had the OWI helped put that out, had statements that the real reason that the Air Force couldn't get off the ground in Honolulu was because trucks driven by Japanese drove down and knocked the propellers off of them, which is absolutely ridiculous. What happened was that the general in charge, thinking about sabotage, had his planes parked nose to nose in various formations, tightly packed on the tarmacs so they could be guarded. And they were perfect targets for the Japanese to come in, and they, since they surprised them, they caught them on the ground, and incredibly, 9 hours later, the same thing happened in the Philippines, even though they knew what had happened in Hawaii because of the time differences.
One of the themes in your book, especially when you look at the Japanese and the Chinese Exclusion Acts, is that in historical contexts, oftentimes our liberal, moderate leaders, our progressives, fail us. Hiram Johnson in California, Franklin Roosevelt during World War II, when during the Cold War, the fear was that there was a communist under every bed. Humphrey and Lehman authored a bill that would have allowed for detention camps for commies. So there is a sense in which the dynamics of politics lead some of our progressives who are holding political office to not resist the racism or whatever, the hysteria that is afoot. Is that a fair assessment?
Oh yes, it's you can go farther than that. The problem is that the people on the right say that the liberals are softies and aren't tough enough. So some of them think that, well, the way to answer that is I can be tougher than they are. I can, and that's a mug's game, and it doesn't get anywhere. It doesn't succeed. It's an attempt at a kind of ideological appeasement, and it doesn't work.
Do you, let's, the final chapter in this terrible thing that was done to the Japanese Americans is that many years later, a commission is formed which does an honest evaluation of what happened, and some recompense is made to people after many of them are dead, but it, in a way is a symbolic gesture that recognized the wrong that was done, which is the other part of this ambivalence that we were talking about, that we go to the dark side, but because of our institutions and our values, we come back. So the question then for today after 9/11 is, how do you grade the way America has responded to the 9/11 attacks? Because when one reads your account of what happened during World War II, there's some aspects of our response that harken back to that dark period of World War II, although there wasn't a large-scale internment of people, although there was some internment over short periods of time for people of Middle Eastern backgrounds.
Well, what happened was, however, and this is an indication that something was learned, is that these weren't American citizens. I'm not saying it's right to do things that aren't that, so that one has to say that there has been some learning curve involved. And interestingly enough, although 25 or 30 years after the evacuation, so-called, of Japanese Americans, teaching at UCLA, I found students, including Japanese American students, who didn't even know it had happened. But because of that redress discussion, when 9/11 came about, almost all the Japanese American experience had become part of the American curriculum. People knew about it and said, hey, let's not do that again. And I must say, at the top, George Bush, not one of my favorite people, and others in his administration made it very, very clear. But there was always this undercurrent. And now we're seeing at the popular level this obscene idiocy of this minister in Florida without a congregation, who suddenly is a focus of national media attention because he says he's going to do something stupid, and I guess after the president says it's a bad thing, the media can't ignore it. But it's really not what we ought to be talking about. But has been happening is that despite all of these things, that this is becoming, the war on terror is becoming, in the minds of many Americans, a war, a crusade against Islam. Although that's not a phrase most of those likely use, and that we're involved in very few sitting politicians, and certainly very few public officials have gone this far. But I won't say the lunatic fringe, because it's too big for that. But the contemporary movement against Muslims, which sees them all as terrorists, is a very dangerous thing.
What do you see as pushing that hysteria back? Obviously, history is important from what you just said, because learning that history of what happened to the Japanese is in the minds of young people, especially as they study diversity and ethnicity in the college. Can we rely on the courts and the political leaders in the context where the media seems to be an unindicted co-conspirator, to go back to the Watergate terms, that by the logic of what it does, it winds up publicizing and spreading some of this lunacy?
Well, it's a serious problem. I certainly don't have any answers to it. There once was a time in the United States when a news program had to conform to certain standards. It's called the Fairness Doctrine. And it didn't stop all kinds of things from happening, but it did put a certain constraint. Now, free speech is one thing, but the courts have, for instance, defined money as speech. You can't stop political contributions because that's stopping free speech. And speech disguised as news should have some sort of objective standard. But when you get people with large audiences believing things like Obama's not a citizen of the United States, you have to begin to reconsider whether we ought not to go back and look at some of the standards that we once set for public news, particularly television news. It's radio and television are quite different from newspapers. It's hard to argue with something you see and listen to as opposed to something you read. And I'm not sure that we haven't gone too far in allowing all kinds of people not to make speeches as they please, but to disguise those people, those things, as news programs and as information. And I think we need to think about that. It's a very difficult problem, and I certainly couldn't write the statute. But the old fairness doctrine, had it been in use today, would have certainly inhibited this unprecedented rise of Fox News.
One final question relating to the other immigration problem that we have now, which is the problem of the borders and the whole inability of the political system to come up with a legislative solution to that problem. Briefly, does history teach us anything about the path that we should go down to not err in the way we have in the past on immigration policy? Or is it just an entirely different problem once you add the current situation into the equation?
I think that there are difficulties in this situation. The fact of the matter is, however, that the United States needs immigrants. In the state of Washington, there were fruit crops this year that didn't get picked because there weren't enough people to pick them. The border is a serious problem. The Mexican border is a serious problem. Not only because of immigration, but because of drugs, and has become a combat zone. Mexico has serious problems, and when your neighbors have serious problems, you have serious problems. But the notion that the border cuts apart two worlds doesn't understand what goes on down there, because the border is really a collection of linked communities from one end to the other, from trying to think of the name of the town, the town at the eastern end, but from San Diego, Tijuana, all the way across El Paso,
yeah.
Ciudad Juarez, and on further. This is a region.
And with a transnational community, really.
Oh,
yeah. Yeah.
And of course they're the Mexican-American population. The fact is that what people don't understand is that the largest number of legal immigrants into the United States every year comes from what country? Mexico.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And there are ways to solve the problem.
But it involves courage on the part of the political leaders and a managing of the hysteria that's clearly out there.
Well, it certainly cannot be handled in the current political situation in which there is no comity in Washington. Washington has become and the Congress has become what term should I use? Has become a non-functional. It does get things done, but it's really become a non-functional body.
Especially on the big issues.
Yeah, but on a lot of the little ones too. Things don't get done. And I don't know what the answer is. And history has no answer to questions like that. These are questions that contemporary Americans, the future, my grandchildren, are going to have to worry about.
One final question requiring a short answer. How should students prepare for the future?
Carefully.
Very good. And on that short note, or did you want to add something?
No. The enormity of current problems is quite serious, and I've always been an optimist. I am less of an optimist today than I have been in any of my previous more than 80 years.
Well, on that note, I would suggest that people read your books. There are many, but I'm going to show two. Prisoners Without Trial, which is about the internment of the Japanese, but also a very nice summary of your larger body of work, Guarding the Golden Door, American Immigration Policy and Immigrants Since 1882. Professor Daniels, thank you very much for being on our program.
Thank you very much for having me here. I've enjoyed it.
Thank you, and thank you very much for joining us for this conversation with history.